like to thank the Vermont Humanities Council. We are again seated here for the 6th season of First Wednesdays. Last year, the 8 lectures brought 617 of you to the library, and that averages out, if my math is correct, about 77 per lecture, which is one of the highest in the state in the nine locations. So people really enjoy these lectures here in Brattleboro. And I expect the average to be a lot higher for this year because in January, Ken Burns will be at the Latches again to talk. So and I'm sure some of you have seen his great Prohibition series, which just ended last night, and that was an excellent television documentary. So we have programs in the back that have the next 7 lectures after this one. So pick up one of those, and you'll be able to hang it on your refrigerator for the future First Wednesdays. I'd like to salute our sponsors. They're both local and program, and these are the organizations and individuals that bring these lectures free to Brattleboro. The local library must raise $2,500 for these lectures, so it's really important that we acknowledge the organizations. The primary one in Brattleboro is the Friends of the Brooks Library, and they support these lectures by hosting book sales and other fundraising events. So if you're not a dues-paying member, I would encourage you to join. And I'd like to introduce the new president, Bob Oser. Bob, are you anywhere nearby? There he is. So let me mention some of these sponsors. Besides the Friends of the Library, we have Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Downs Racklin Martin, the Wyndham World Affairs Council of Vermont. And then there are the program sponsors. There are Brattleboro Historical Society, Dakin Benelli, PC, and KSC Partners. And the Vermont Department of Libraries is the statewide sponsor. And this year we actually had one of you donated funds for this lecture series. So we really appreciate that. It was a sizable donation to help us out. And last but not least, the Vermont Humanities Council, which is the overall sponsor of these lectures. So let me introduce our speaker for tonight. Christopher Benfey is the Dean of Faculty at Mount Holyoke College and a Mellon Professor of English. He has emerged over the past decade as a prolific critic, essayist, and author whose reviews in the New York Times Sunday Book Review, the New Republic, and the New York Review of Books, and the Times Literary Supplement have established him as a distinguished contemporary arbiter of modern and late 20th century American literature. His current research concerns New England literary and visual culture during the Gilded Age, and he has a couple of new books coming out. I hope he'll maybe mention those at the end. So please welcome Dr. Benfey.
Thanks, Jerry. I feel a little like Lady Gaga with this thing coming out of my head. Well, I'm thrilled to be in Brattleboro. I went to school up the hill at the Putney School, so Brattleboro is not unfamiliar to me. I was at the Putney School during what I imagine must have been its wildest years from about, well, maybe not, actually. But 1969 to 72 was wild enough for me. It's lovely to see one of my favorite teachers in the front row, Amelia Bruce, with her husband, Len Bruce. Amelia was my 9th grade Spanish teacher. And she had a wonderful for me, a wonderful pedagogical approach. She had us read the Diaries of Aeneas Nin, and then try to write comparable diary entries of our own in Spanish. It's sort of a double challenge, you know. But those Aeneas Nin pages for a 16-year-old from 15-year-old from Indiana were quite riveting and gave me a taste for writing, even in English. So great to see Amelia and Len here. Nice to see Malcolm Wright as well. Where is Malcolm Wright? A potter I hugely, there's the man I hugely admire. He doesn't remember me, but I remember visiting his studio when I was a student at Putney. Putney had no pottery program in those days, and we lobbied hard for it. After my freshman year at Putney, I spent a year in Japan and worked in a pottery village in the Tamba area. And a few years ago, Malcolm heard me give a talk called Red Brick, Black Mountain, White Clay. A talk about 3 parts of my own life with clay. And that, Jerry invited me to flog my book. So a book by that title, Red Brick, Black Mountain, White Clay, will appear in the Penguin imprint in March. So please don't forget me. I'm obsessed with this town right now because not only because I'm mindful of what you all have lived through since the storm, but I've been obsessed with your neighbor Kipling and his time up on the ridge for a long, long time, and I do think that is going to be the next book I inflict upon you. So you'll have to tell me what Kipling was really doing in Vermont aside from getting into fights with his brother-in-law and writing the Jungle Books. I published a book a few years back called The Great Wave, and that's the book I'm going to surf off of today. The talk I'm going to give is an English professorish talk. English professors like me love to talk about irony, a word nobody understands. So everyone says, so ironic. And someone else says, no, it's not ironic at all. That's not what ironic means. Don't you mean sarcastic? But this talk is actually about irony. It's called New England and Japan, an ironic love affair. As though we know what love is, but, irony and love, that's what I'll be talking about here, or the irony of love, or an ironic love affair between New England and Japan. And then we'll have some questions. I'm happy to talk about this book, this topic, or in the unlikely event you've read other books of mine, we can talk about those too. All right. So Americans like us like to imagine that first encounter a little over a century and a half ago through a veil of legend and myth. Here's Commodore Matthew Perry with his black ships bristling with modern weapons. There are the Japanese in their wooden boats, armed with swords and oars and ornamental helmets. It's like a diorama of Christopher Columbus, landing in the New World, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria bobbing in the shallows. Or the Thanksgiving diorama of the Pilgrim Fathers receiving squash and succotash from Squanto and his feathered friends. Here are the modern men of the West, opening the far corners of the world to knowledge and conquest. There are the natives, the aborigines, lost in their timeless rituals, their unfathomable ignorance, their quaint and childish religious beliefs, their fear. Of course, we know that it wasn't quite like that in reality. We now congratulate ourselves in regarding Columbus as more an invader than an explorer. We aren't so sure now that Squanto was so wise in helping the Pilgrims feel so completely at home in Massachusetts. Pilgrims usually go home after their pilgrimage, but these Pilgrims never did go home. And finally, it was the Indians who were forced to leave. But let's return to our diorama image of Commodore Perry of Newport, Rhode Island, arriving in Uraga Bay. We now know that the Japanese were far more knowledgeable about the West and about Western learning than the Americans thought. We now know that even in those world-shifting weeks of 1853 and then again in 1854, when Perry returned to extract a treaty, we now know that the Japanese were developing a strategy. It was a strategy that Lafcadio Hearn, have you all heard of Lafcadio Hearn? Great American, Greek, Irish wanderer, eventually a Japanese citizen. A strategy that Lafcadio Hearn likened to jujutsu, or as we call it, jujitsu. Ju means softness or yielding. The master of jujutsu absorbs the strength of his opponent and uses it against him. The Japanese would open themselves up. They would absorb what the West had to offer. Japan would invite Western experts to come to Japan and instruct the Japanese in the ways of modern steam power, the ideas of Darwin, public schools. And Japan would send Japanese young men to the West to learn about watchmaking from the Swiss and weaponry from the Prussians. The Japanese would learn to teach perspective and other tricks of Western art to Japanese children. Teach them how to use pencils and pens instead of the brush, and so on. In the space of 50 years, and especially during the period from about 1868 to 1904, the heart of the Meiji era, in the space of 50 years, Japan did not become a colony of the United States, a frontier outpost like California or Hawaii. Japan turned herself into something else entirely, and something, as we know, something quite extraordinary. It was all jujutsu, absorbing, assessing, deflecting, reinventing. The Japanese Ministry of Education took the lion's share of the national budget during the Meiji era, a whole economy based on education. The whole country was on a crash course in the ways of the West, the modern world. Japan would show off its accomplishments, like straight A's on its report card, at World's Fairs in Philadelphia, Vienna, Chicago. Here are our fire trucks, our medical apparatus, our incredible literacy rates. The Japanese quickly discovered that Western audiences had no interest whatsoever in such accomplishments. What did Americans care about Japanese literacy rates? What Americans preferred was an imaginary Japan of fans and porcelain, woodblock prints, geisha, samurai. And then came the final exam. All those straight A's. Final exam. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Just over 100 years ago, the treaty of it was signed nearby Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Japan before Perry was living in the Middle Ages, and now, half a century later, with the war with Russia, Japan was challenging a great European power. The Japanese victory in this unbelievably brutal lead-up to World War I, when trench warfare and other great inventions of modern warfare were first tried out. The Japanese victory gave the Japanese a place at the table of modern powers. I once saw the actual long black table at Frank Lloyd Wright's Imperial Hotel, the little bits of it that are left in the theme park outside Nagoya. The childish and timeless little nation had grown up, and Japanese observers were quick to note the ironies. Take Okakura Kakuzo, for example. Brilliant Japanese writer, art historian who spent part of his career in Boston. Many of you may know Okakura's The Book of Tea, wonderful, wonderful classic of our American literature, classic in Japanese literature. According to Okakura in The Book of Tea, the average Westerner was accustomed, quote, to regard Japan as barbarous while she indulged in the gentle arts of peace. He calls her civilized since she came to commit wholesale slaughter on Manchurian battlefields. I'll repeat that. Wonderful line. The average Westerner was accustomed to regard Japan as barbarous while she indulged in the gentle arts of peace. He calls her civilized since she began to commit wholesale slaughter on the Manchurian battlefields. End of quote. A wonderful irony there. Barbarians are peaceful. Civilized nations make war. What about the other characters in our little diorama, the Americans? During the same period of time, the second half of the 19th century, the United States was on a strangely parallel course of national development. Commodore Perry had his little temper tantrum in Edo Bay when he told the Japanese, in the name of President Millard Fillmore, that the Japanese must stop mistreating whaling ships that ran aground on their islands and must let merchant ships refuel and reprovision on their way to Calcutta and the Philippines. It was in the text from Millard Fillmore that the words, our overtures are completely Pacific, were first voiced. Pacific Overtures, the title of Sondheim's musical. It's a complete failure, but very interesting title. I wanted to call my book Pacific Overtures. I also wanted to call it A Season of Nirvana. All of these ideas were shot down. After this temper tantrum, as I say, the United States lost interest in Japan for 20 years. The Americans were distracted. The distraction was the American Civil War. When Commodore Perry returned to the United States after opening Japan, he expected a hero's welcome. He expected parades in Washington and New York, celebrations at the White House, the return of the great opener of Japan. Perry was ignored. Washington, D.C. had other things to worry about, like the extension of slavery into the West, threatening noises about secession from Southern senators. Commodore Perry, a modern man, decided he needed better PR. And he traveled to Liverpool and asked Nathaniel Hawthorne, of all people, if Hawthorne would consider writing a book about the opening of Japan, with Perry as the hero. Hawthorne was tempted. It sounded like a nice little book concept. As Hawthorne wrote in his journal on I'm not making this up. As Hawthorne wrote in his journal on December 28, 1854, quote, it would be a very desirable labor for a young literary man, or for that matter, an old one. For the world can scarcely have in reserve a less hackneyed theme than Japan. End of quote. Hawthorne, alas, had other books on his mind, and he suggested that Perry might ask Herman Melville, because Melville actually knew something about the Pacific. Hawthorne thought Melville might write the book that Perry had in mind. Perry, stupidly, decided to write the book himself. And Herman Melville's History of the Opening of Japan is one of the great might-have-beens in American literature. Well, the United States had its civil war with the industrial North, defeating the feudal and agrarian South, and embarking on a period of spectacular economic and industrial growth, the period we call the Gilded Age. In 1898, the U.S. had a splendid little war with Spain, a crippled ancient power to show that the U.S. would not be pushed around in its own neighborhood. Japan, too, had a civil war culminating in what is known as the Satsuma Rebellion of the late 1870s, a war that, as in the United States, ended with the modernizers and industrializers triumphant and the feudal arrangements of the South in shambles. The samurai went the way of the southern planter into the world of movies and popular nostalgia. Gone with the Wind, The Seven Samurai, and more recently, The Last Samurai, sort of combination of the two. I once read an op-ed piece for the New York Times about The Last Samurai. It was about Bob Dylan, who'd stolen a lot of lyrics for his album Love and Theft from a book about a Japanese gangster. I thought the Tom Cruise vehicle was a major work of art, but even my kids could tell it sucked. I think they were 11 and 13. By the dawn of the 20th century, there were two new players on the international stage, two battle-tested young nations in love with modern technology and eager to test the waters of empire. We now know that Japan and the United States were on a collision course. The encroaching black ships off Yokohama would be avenged in the destruction of the ships in Pearl Harbor. But such things could hardly have been predicted in 1905, the high point of Gilded Age America's love affair with Japan. Maybe all love affairs have built-in ironies. We're often mistaken about what makes us lovable. But this Japanese-American love affair was more ironic than most. My book, The Great Wave, is about this ironic love affair of Japan and the United States. Herman Melville, in one of the books he did write, Moby Dick, called Japan before Perry, quote, that double-bolted land, Japan. Melville always dreamed about traveling to Japan. You may remember that the whole push of Moby Dick is to get to the Japan whaling grounds. It's known that the white whale is in the Japan whaling grounds. And Captain Ahab was dismasted off the coast of Japan, and the Pequod's literal masts were replaced by trees cut on Hokkaido. Anyway, Herman Melville called Japan that double-bolted land. And my argument in this book is that Japan had to be open not once, but twice. Perry did the easy part, forcing Japan to open her major ports to Western ships and Western trade. I think it was the great accomplishment of Millard Fillmore's reign in office. But there was a second, more significant opening of Japan. This second opening happened much more slowly, and it asked much more of those doing the opening. It was one thing to fire a few cannonballs across Edo Bay and run a miniature railroad along the beach to impress the gaping samurai, as Perry and his men did. It was quite another to grasp the subtle moves of judo or the tenets of esoteric Buddhism, or to understand why the most highly prized vessel in the tea ceremony was a dun-colored water jar that had buckled in the kiln. Malcolm knows that. This second opening of Japan was the work of men and women who realized that Japan had things to offer besides safe harbor for American whaling crews or coal for merchant ships bound for China. And this cultural opening of Japan, the second opening of Japan, is the subject of my book, The Great Wave. The book tells the story of a tightly knit group of travelers, connoisseurs, collectors, scientists, spiritual waifs, and pilgrims who dedicated themselves to exploring and preserving what they referred to as old Japan. A sense of urgency impelled them, for they were convinced, Darwinians that they were, that their quarry was on the verge of extinction. The irony was that just as New Englanders were falling in love with old Japan, Japan itself was reinventing itself as a modern state. Several of these Gilded Age American emissaries were hired by the Japanese to impart instruction on modernization in the Western mode. But they left Japan convinced that preservation of the old was far more important than aping the new. I'm going to pause for a moment to define that odd and interesting term, the Gilded Age. A friend of mine, Peter Grilly, who runs the Japan Society in Boston, sent my book to the Emperor of Japan. And the Emperor of Japan thanked him and read a few pages, and then he said, he met with Peter. On a cloud somewhere. And he said to Peter, I understand from my dictionary what a golden age is, but what is a gilded age? Actually, is the nub of the matter. The Gilded Age in the United States lasted roughly from the end of the American Civil War into the beginning of the 20th century. It's defined loosely, different dates. As such, it corresponds very closely to the Meiji era in Japan, named for the Emperor Meiji. And both periods followed, as I said, on the heels of civil wars. Both the Gilded Age and the Meiji era were periods of rapid and unfathomable change, when old certainties of religion and tradition were abandoned, social status in terms of inherited fortunes or inherited swords gained or lost overnight. We now tend to think of the Gilded Age as a period of high style and flamboyant taste, the world of Newport Mansion, Saratoga horse races. Does anyone know who named the Gilded Age the Gilded Age? Mr. Twain. I think he must have named everything. I think he invented the whole United States in his books. Mark Twain, with his Hartford neighbor, wrote a book called The Gilded Age. And his point was not that there was anything glamorous about the Gilded Age. He meant that it was not a golden age. It just sometimes looked like one. The Golden Age was that classical fantasy of paradise long ago and far away. Mark Twain said, no, this is just a Gilded Age. Veneer of gold concealed the corruption and dross and confusion underneath the gilding. He named it like in 1869. You know, it's like Mark Twain names things before. That's what I mean. That he invented the whole thing. Interestingly enough, Natsume Soseki, the great novelist of Meiji, Soseki, S-O-S-E-K-I. Soseki saw something of the same quality that Mark Twain saw in the people around him. The hero of a wonderful book called Sode Kara, which in English is translated as and then, Sode Kara. The hero of that novel, 1909, is an aesthetically minded young man of excellent family who harbors doubts about his father's generation, the generation that modernized and transformed Japan. Quote, there was a time when his father had looked like gold to him, writes Soseki of his hero Daisuke. Quote, many of his seniors had looked like gold, many of this young man's older acquaintances had looked like gold. Therefore, his own gold plating had been all the more painful, and he had been impatient to become solid gold himself. But once his keen eyes penetrated directly to the inner layers of those other people, his efforts suddenly came to seem foolish, end of quote. The Meiji era itself, in Soseki's view, was more gilded than golden. So much for the Gilded Age. English professors like me love to define their terms, so while we're at it, let's try to define that other slippery term, irony. Let's call it, following the dictionary, quote, an incongruity or mismatch. An incongruity or mismatch between what might be expected and what actually occurs. You can already see how this word can't really be defined. Oh yes, irony. It's an incongruity or mismatch between what might be expected and what actually occurs. Like surprise or one of the other things that are mismatched between. Anyway, I've said that Japan and the United States had an ironic love affair. The idea of an ironic love affair reminds me of a famous Christmas story. Which one? Yes, The Gift of the Magi, by the American Gilded Age writer known as O. Henry. I'm sure you all know the story. I hear that you know it. A husband and wife who are short of money are determined to give each other very handsome Christmas gifts nonetheless. The woman, Della, has beautiful long hair. The husband, Jim, has a beautiful gold watch. The story is perfect. She has beautiful long hair. He has a beautiful gold watch. Della cuts off all her hair, sells it to a wig maker for $20, and uses the money to buy a chain for her husband's watch. Jim, meanwhile, sells his watch to buy tortoiseshell combs for his wife's long hair. I found this story heartbreaking as a child, and now it occurs to me that the hair does grow back. You know, is it another mismatch with the story? The watch doesn't grow back, does it? But better for the wife to be happy. I once heard a definition of a good marriage. She asks him nicely to do it, and he does it. And every part is important. You know, asks nicely, does it. The relationship between Japan and New England was a bit like the gift of the Magi. And here I find myself thinking back to that other famous exchange of gifts between Commodore Perry and the Emperor of Japan. The Emperor of Japan back then, not my friend Peter's emperor. Perry proudly offered his gifts to the Japanese: a telegraph apparatus, rifles and revolvers, a daguerreotype camera, a miniature railroad. You get the idea. Telegraph, revolvers, camera, railroad. The Japanese presented in return some pieces of blue and white porcelain, some lacquerware, a few fans, dolls, and boxes of assorted seashells. You get the idea. The Americans gave modernity, the modern world, and the Japanese gave tradition. The Americans gave technology. The Japanese gave art. The Americans gave use. The Japanese gave beauty. Perry's American Navy guys thought the gifts from the Japanese were ridiculous. In retrospect, it's not at all clear who made the better bargain in that exchange. The Japanese did very well with the cameras. And the trains. In one sense, old Japan vanished at the moment of its discovery. Quote, "For old Japan was like an oyster. To open it was to kill it," as longtime resident and Japan hand Basil Chamberlain lamented. Old Japan was like an oyster. To open it was to kill it. But it turned out that something of old Japan, like the shrines carried in the great Shinto festivals, was portable, could be recovered. It could even be relocated in Boston, for example, in the great museums of the MFA and what's the one in Salem called? The Peabody Essex, or New York City, or Washington, D.C., and Japan could have a kind of second life in these great museums. President Theodore Roosevelt had a judo room in the White House. He had his own private judo instructor, right in the heart of American power. There's a wonderful moment when John Hay, who was in the cabinet, says, the president came in with his judo master to show us a few moves. A big reason why Roosevelt was chosen to broker the Russo-Japanese War, he won the first Nobel Peace Prize for solving the problem of the Russo-Japanese War. A big reason why Roosevelt was asked to broker the deal was that the Japanese trusted him. They knew that he admired Japan as a plucky little country that could overcome a stronger opponent through judo, just as Roosevelt imagined himself as a plucky little guy who'd been bullied as a child and learned to stand up for himself. This recovery of old Japan was the work of men and women who realized that to open Japan culturally meant that they had to open themselves in turn and risk self-transformation in the process. To put it a different way, the opening of Japan occurred as much in the hearts and minds of individuals as in some particular location in Japan or New England. So one question I found myself posing in the Great Wave was, what kind of people risk such transformation? What kind of people risk such opening of themselves, internal changes? And looking back over the characters in my book, Ernest Fenollosa, remarkable philosopher, connoisseur of Japanese painting, collector of much of the greatest Japanese artwork in the MFA in Boston, Lafcadio O'Hearn, Mabel Loomis Todd. Do you know the name Mabel Loomis Todd? The Scarlet Woman of Amherst. A friend of mine said, Chris, do all your books have Mabel Loomis Todd in them? She was Emily Dickinson's editor. She was Emily Dickinson's brother's mistress. She edited Dickinson's poetry, made it public, made it known to the world. She was the first Western woman to climb Mount Fuji. Her husband was the astronomer at Amherst College, and he went to Japan to try to photograph solar eclipses. And Mabel Todd risked transformation in writing about Hokkaido and the things she saw there, like women suckling bears. That was something everyone reported they saw in Hokkaido. In any case, I think one aspect of these kinds of figures who risk self-transformation is that for one reason or another, they're unmoored, they're cut loose from their own society. Sometimes the unmooring was literal, as in the case of sea drifters like the amazing John Manjiro. John Manjiro was a fisherman on the island of Shikoku in Japan, and he was shipwrecked off the coast of Japan and rescued by an American whaling ship out of Fairhaven, New Bedford, Massachusetts. Manjiro was adopted by the whaling captain, educated in Fairhaven, learned how to be a skilled navigator in turn, and then Manjiro returned to Japan, and he ended up being an interpreter and an advisor for the Japanese in how to deal with Americans like Commodore Perry. Remarkable story. If you ever go to Fairhaven, all of the Manjiro materials are part of sort of historical walks and so on. Sometimes the mooring was more figurative. Take, for example, Edward Sylvester Morse, one of my heroes from this book. Edward Sylvester Morse, longtime head of the Peabody Essex Museum. Morse was a man who perfectly embodies the irony I'm describing. What cut Morse loose from his American roots was religion. He grew up in a small town on the coast of Maine where he collected seashells. And he came of age in the narrow world of American evangelical Christianity. It felt like liberation for Morse to come under the sway of the Christianized natural science of his first mentor, Louis Agassiz of Harvard. Agassiz looked to the fossil record to prove that the floods and fixed species of the biblical creation story. Darwin was the enemy for Agassiz, and young Morse was enlisted in the great battle to prove Darwin wrong. Morse worked on marine worms. Agassiz wanted Morse to prove that under the microscope there was no relation at all between fossil brachiopods and living organisms in the ocean. So Morse looks through the microscope and finds that they're exactly the same. And his adoption of Darwinism had the force of a conversion experience. He felt himself adrift. When Morse learned during the late 1870s that the coastal waters of Japan were the great marine repository of sea worms, Morse looked for opportunities to make the pilgrimage to Japan. He was hired by the Japanese to teach Darwin and modern science. But Morse fell in love with traditional Japanese culture instead. Like many American men of the 1890s, he suffered from neurasthenia. We would say he suffered from depression. And a wise doctor in Japan said, "You need a hobby." And Morse was walking around the back streets of Tokyo. Tokyo only has back streets. He was walking around the back streets of Tokyo, and he passed a pottery maker. And he saw that some of the pots were in the shape of scallop shells. And he said, I was a seashell collector as a child. Maybe I'll collect pottery. And he started collecting pottery just as systematically as he had collected seashells until he felt that he had discovered every single kind of Japanese folk pottery. And then he shipped it all back to Boston, and it now can be seen in the MFA, the Peabody Essex, and some of it is in the Zoological Museum at Harvard. And it did cure his depression, so. Get a hobby. So, hired to teach modern science, Morse falls in love with traditional Japanese culture. And he preserves Japanese handicrafts to keep them from going extinct. He becomes an expert on Japanese vernacular architecture. He writes the most important book on Japanese ordinary home architecture. And half the houses from the 1890s in Brattleboro have something to do with Morse's book on Japanese homes and their surroundings, a book you can still get in Dover or upstairs. So, hired to modernize Japan, Morse tried instead to traditionalize it. That's the ironic love affair I'm talking about. But the greatest ironist of all concerning Japanese-American relations was a man I've already mentioned, Okakura. Okakura Kakuzo, or Okakura Tenshin, as he's known in Japan. Okakura, like Morse, was also unmoored in his own society. His father was born a samurai, but knew that the world was changing. So he was determined that his oldest son would be equipped for a modernized and westernized Japan. So Okakura was trained to be a modern Japanese. He was enrolled in a missionary school in Yokohama run by a man called James Hepburn, who wrote the first great Japanese-American dictionary. Okakura learned perfect English. He became the art historian Ernest Spenalosa's favorite student at Tokyo Imperial University, and he was assigned the mission of modernizing Japan's art academies and museums along Western lines. So Okakura and Fenollosa traveled to the United States. They traveled to Europe, trying to figure out the best methods of teaching art. And what they discovered was that in the West, Japan owed her entire prestige to her own traditional art. So Okakura became, like Edward Morse, not a modernizer, but a preservationist, and a living embodiment of old Japan in Boston. He was a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston 100 years ago. Isabella Gardner, who collected everything, also collected Okakura. She showed him off in full kimono in her box at the symphony. She hosted a tea ceremony by candlelight. I love this idea. We'll have it by candlelight. A tea ceremony by candlelight she hosted, and it was performed by Okakura in her villa on the Fenway. In his cult masterpiece, The Book of Tea, written in magnificent, eloquent, Emersonian English, Okakura wrote of the tea ceremony as a rite of national independence performed by samurai. He compared it to the Boston Tea Party, the great Boston tea ceremony. Okakura was even an ironist in the language of clothing. Okakura's theatrical practice of wearing only Japanese clothing in the West, counter to the Meiji practice of adopting Western formal attire, Okakura's theatrical Japanese clothing attracted much notice from an admiring press. Okakura once remarked that unless one's English was flawless, as his was, one should wear Western clothes in the West. If your English was really good, you could wear kimono. This is probably a principle for all of life, but I'm not sure how one would apply it. I'll close with an anecdote testifying to Okakura's habitual irony and to his dexterity with English, as recorded from his Boston sojourn in 1904. This story also shows his sensitivity with regard to racial stereotypes of Asians. Asians then and now are always referred to as imitators, copy us. Okakura and a couple of his Japanese companions, all artists, were walking in kimono through the streets of Boston, minding their own business. They were stopped by a wagon in the street who asked, "What sort of knees are you people? Are you Chinese? Or Japanese? Or Javanese?" Okakura calmly responded, "We are Japanese gentlemen, but what sort of key are you? Are you a Yankee? Or a donkey? Or a monkey?" Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions on any subject. You've been a very nice audience. I'm a very tired man. Yes?
It seems to me the process you talked about in some ways continues, whether it's Amy Lowell or Gary Snyder, and somehow that image of Japan hasn't changed.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Amy Lowell is an interesting case. She did write, as you know, some of the very early attempts at adopting a Japanese aesthetic in her poetry. And imagism in general, the movement that she and Ezra Pound fought over. They sort of had their warring forces. Imagism itself takes so much from a Western notion of what Japanese poetry looks like and sounds like. Amy Lowell was a little sister of the crew in my book. One of the figures I talk about is the really amazing Percival Lowell. Percival Lowell of the Lowells of Lowell, gazillionaire mill families. Another brother was president of Harvard. Abbott Lowell. Percival Lowell was another of these men adrift. And he traveled to Japan and became a sort of self-taught expert in Japanese religion, and specifically Buddhist esoteric religion. He wrote a book called The Soul of the Far East, and it was Percival Lowell's ecstatic book about Eastern religion that persuaded Lafcadio Hearn that there was still an authentic place in the world. Hearn had left Cincinnati, where he became an expert on African-American music and was married to a former African-American slave. Cincinnati got too modern. He settled in New Orleans. New Orleans was just right for a while for Lafcadio Hearn. He loved all of the stories of octoroons and cavaliers, and wrote books based on New Orleans mythology. And then electric light came to New Orleans with the Cotton Exposition of 1885. And the only thing Hearn liked about the Cotton Exposition was the Japanese exhibits there. And he hated the electric light, and he decided he needed an authentic traditional place. And Percival Lowell's book persuaded him that that was the place to go. And Percival Lowell sent these ecstatic letters home, and little Amy, little fat Amy as he called her, read the letters and fell in love with Japan. Never went to Japan. Never got anywhere near Japan. Just as Ezra Pound, one of our greatest Japanese writers and poets, never got anywhere near Japan. Japan is, as this gentleman said, a kind of continuing, enduring artifact in need of our imagination. Gary Snyder's Japan is exactly this Japan. It's a Japan of spiritual depth, of exquisite taste, of handicraft, of traditional values, of peace. One has to remember that the Japanese are also very adept at war. But when I myself went to Japan after my first year at the Putney School and studied Japanese with, what was her name at the experiment in international? Toshiko Phipps. I had a year of Japanese study with the wonderful Toshiko Phipps. I don't mean to make fun of myself. Maybe make fun of myself a little bit. But, I learned how to paint calligraphy with a brush, and all of it seemed what you did in Japan. So for 150 years, this idea of Japan has been consistent. Of course, overlaid is an idea that the Japanese are hyper-modernists, that they're like the best technologists in the world, that the only good cars and televisions and cameras are made in Japan. Tofu, Sony, irony. It's ironic, the gifts will give you a telegraph and a daguerreotype. You got a fan and some porcelain. But the other thing is just how incredibly intertwined these two countries are for 150 years, that they're just in each other's back pockets all through this period. When Nixon goes to China, it's, what will happen to the relationship with Japan? Sorry, that was a very long question. Very short question, very long answer. Another question?
What I find is ironic is that we completely dismiss the bloody history that Japan has up until we discovered the Meiji era, and how it had been
continuous warfare.
Yes, and it's
and
bloody.
Then sort of, then around 1600, 1610, sort of massive, heavily armed reign of peace and xenophobia. But island countries have to defend themselves. Okakura was in his fantasy of the of the tea ceremony. He associated the birth of the tea ceremony with the Mongol attempt to invade Japan. So Kublai Khan sends his ships to Japan, one more attempt to invade Japan. And according to legend, a great wind comes and destroys all of the ships in Edo Bay that are about to attack Japan, destroys all the Mongol ships. And the great wind is called the kamikaze, great wind. And Okakura says the tea ceremony was developed in relation to that moment of national pride and national defense. And then he says, just like the Boston tea ceremony. the same thing. But we need Japan to be that Pacific image. One of the extraordinary facts of the last 50 years of and I say this with no particular line on it, but Japan is seen just as much as a peaceful victim of World War II our view of Hiroshima, and is the most warlike of all participants in World War II. Another irony. Yes?
I remember as a child, a long time ago, that anything that said made in Japan was usually inexpensive and kind of dismissed, but not that we didn't play with the toys and so on, but that's what I associated with Japan.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And there are curious waves of, my whole book is built around the image of waves. In the 1890s, Japan sent a lot of exquisite bronzeware to the West, and extraordinary porcelain, of course. These were hugely popular with American collectors, and then they were mass marketed, and the Japanese have found that they have to control their exports and to get both the money and the volume, or the money and the volume, the quality, etc. But I certainly remember that from my childhood, made in Japan. So another oddity that Japan is both the place of the highest perfection and it's in a sort of zero-sum game with China, that when Japan is regarded as a place of exquisite workmanship, the Chinese are regarded as selling cheap stuff and vice versa. They seem in a, yeah.
To what extent does New England or Vermont have an image in the United States not unlike Japan's?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that's really another theme in the book, that New England is capturing an idea of old New England in perfect parallel with the preservation of old Japan. Many of the Japan hands, Henry Adams, Percival Lowell, Amy Lowell, Mabel Loomis Todd, are embarked in both projects. They are, at the same time that they are dreaming up a version of old Japan, they're dreaming up a version of old New England. Mabel Loomis Todd markets Emily Dickinson as a voice of traditional old New England values, a kind of New England nun of renunciation. And at the same time, and in Hokkaido, she writes a Dickinson poem with sumie and a brush on a Japanese scroll. So these are preservationists, both of old New England and old Japan. Even my man Kipling had an idea of old Japan. He wrote some of the great, great early letters on Japan. He's a very young journalist. Kipling's father was a decorator in the pottery works of Wedgwood, and he named his son after Lake Rudyard in the Five Towns, where Wedgwood is. And when Kipling went to Japan, he was interested in the exquisite lacquerware and porcelain and painting of Japan. Goes back to England, falls in love with a nice young Brattleboro girl, and decides to take her around the world. And who should be in the boat as they head for New York to meet the in-laws but Henry Adams, another of the guys who's in all of my books, major figure in the Great Wave. So Henry Adams takes the measure of Rudyard Kipling. Kipling stops in Brattleboro, takes the railroad with Carey, gets as far as Japan, 1893, and the banks collapse. No more money. He can't pay anything. He's got to go back to Brattleboro and make some money. So they experience Japan, and then they go back to old New England, build their little Indian fantasy up on the hills. Old New England, old Japan. Come together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher.